Hi everyone! For chapter 13, we will talk about the structural anatomy of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. It is relatively a simple and straightforward chapter. Just have to remember which direction is for what type of information coming in or out of the central nervous system. So the bulk of the somatic nervous system is covered in this chapter, and that's why when we get to chapter 15 in the last lecture, it's just a short portion on different types of sensory receptors there is for the somatic nervous system. All right, so let's get started. When we talk about the spinal cord, it is highly related to the variety of reflexes we can do. When sensory information comes in toward the central nervous system, there's always an appropriate response coming out of it on the other end as a motor command. So some of these reflexes are quick, like sudden jerk of a muscle. Some of it are slow, like secretion of fluids. So some of it are just, at the level of the spinal cord as the reflex center, and some of it have to get to the brain. And hence in chapter 14, we talked about the 12 cranial nerves and what they function for. And some of those has to do with reflex center in the brain, or what we call cranial reflexes. We'll talk about different classification of reflexes when we get to the last part of this chapter. Now, so this particular chapter 13, we will talk about some of the spinal nerves that's involved from the spinal cord, and what they will do in terms of reflex center in the spinal cord that results in spinal reflexes. For the lab on human reflex physiology, you will learn about a few cranial and spinal reflexes. Those that are cranial reflexes means they have to send the information towards the brain, and those that are spinal reflexes, they only send information to the spinal cord itself, and the spinal cord will send out the correct motor command. It does not require any input coming from the brain. So that's why with a lot of these spinal reflexes we'll talk about at the end of the chapter, we're not consciously controlling our reactions because we don't need to. The spinal cord does it. Usually when we're needing to consciously aware or control a certain motor movement, you need the brain. Those signals need to come from the brain and they need to get to the brain. But if it's just going through the spinal cord and coming right back out, usually we're not aware of it and everything happens automatically. Okay? So remember how the reflex goes in a reflex arc where there are receptors, and sensory receptors can go straight to the brain, or some just go through the spinal cord as I was talking about, and it will have this from the reflex center either in the brain or the spinal cord. You have motor commands coming out of the central nervous system onto your effectors, which can be muscles, glands, or adipose tissue in response to those sensory information coming through. Okay? All right. So, and just like the brain, the spinal cord also contains both gray and white matter. Gray matter are still coming from the same cellular components, your neuron cell body, which includes, remember, the Nissl bodies, which include your rough ER and your ribosomes, where it gives it that gray color. And white matter are still your myelinated axons due to the amount of lipids that's inside myelin itself. And we'll talk about details of these gray matter and white matter of the spinal cord later within the lecture. Now, for functional classification, cranial nerves had sensory, motor, or mixed, which we call having both types of information coming through to that particular cranial nerve. But spinal nerves are all considered as mixed nerves, okay, which means they have both sensory and motor functions because they contain and splits into both sensory and motor fibers, and we'll talk about that when we get through to the detailed structure of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So let's go through the basic structural anatomy of the spinal cord first before we get into their functional application. So for the spinal cord, we have already learned from our bone lab that it resides within the vertebral foramen of each vertebrate bones. Remember, your vertebrate bones in general kind of looks like a little triangle, and then you have the hole in the middle, okay, with the body and the spinous process and transverse processes on either side. And that hole in the middle was called vertebral foramen, which I was mentioning in your lab review video. I talked about how the spinal cord has to go through there. So the spinal cord is pretty much a long column of nerve fibers that runs from the most inferior portion of the brain. That's why when I talked about the brain, I talked about the medulla oblongata, which blends and merge with the spinal cord. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is still part of the brain portion, and it's the most inferior portion of it before we get to the spinal cord. It goes from then that medulla oblongata all the way down to the coccyx bone. Remember, the at the end of your vertebral column, you have your ox coxa on the left and right side, and you also have the sacral bone. And sacral bone forms a fuse bone with the coccyx bone. So the whole spinal cord travels all the way down to that particular region. Now, it serves as the origin of many spinal nerves. So all these spinal nerves, you see these little thingies sticking out, okay, these lines sticking out of the spinal cord. Those are the spinal nerves that radiates out from the spinal cord as a connection for communication between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So remember, central nervous system is your brain and the spinal cord. And once we get to the spinal nerves, that's already the start of your peripheral nervous system, okay? So for chapter 14, we learned that there is a cerebrospinal fluid that flows and circulates within the brain and goes down into the spinal cord via the central canal. And the function of the cerebrospinal fluid for the brain is the same for the spinal cord as well. It serves as that shock absorber and diffusion medium for the cells within the spinal cord, whether it's for waste material or nutrients and gases. Okay, important gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, there are two areas of enlargement in the spinal cord. One is called the cervical enlargement, which is this portion right here. Let me erase that other arrow, so it's not covering up the cervical enlargement. So that's the cervical enlargement. And why it's enlarged is because it is where the nerves from the shoulder and upper limbs merge with the spinal cord. So all of those come in here, and limbs, okay, which is the hand part, all come up towards this portion of the spinal cord. So that's why it's enlarged, because it's gathering a lot of axons and nerves, parts of the neuron from multiple, from those places, okay? And then the lumbosacral, or the lumbar enlargement right here, is where nerves that innervate the pelvis and the lower limbs comes into the spinal cord. So a lot of this area, you will see nerves coming down this way, all the way down, and some of them will travel all the way down to your toes, okay? Which is what I was talking about, how some neurons can be more than a meter long, because it will connect the receptors from your toes all the way up to your spinal cord. Okay, so the conus medullaris is the region inferior to the lumbar region, or lumbar enlargement, right over here. Okay, so this is the conus medullaris. Again, let me erase some of this stuff. Okay, so this conish region right there is the conus medullaris, okay? And I remember how this part of the spinal cord looks like on models or picture is that it has the word conus in it, which sounds a lot like cone. And that's kind of what it looks like here on the spinal cord. It tapers off in this fashion and forms a cone shape within that region. So you will never forget where conus medullaris is. You should be looking for a cone-shaped region that tapers off and corners out, okay? The spinal cord ends in a region called the filum terminale, which is just a slender strand of fibrous tissue that ends at the coccyx bone right here. So this you will see that there is a yellow strand, okay, yellow strand going down this way, and it attaches to the coccyx bone. So that's the filum terminale. And my way of remembering this is this is where it should be for filum terminale, is that phylum sounds kind of like phino, okay? And terminale spells a lot like terminal. So it's kind of like the final terminal of the spinal cord, the final terminal section of the spinal cord, which should represent the very end of the spinal cord. So all of these anatomical terminologies we're not using every day, single day of our lives, it makes a whole lot easier to remember when you come up with something like that, like I continuously keep bringing up and mentioning throughout the different chapters of this semester. All right, so filum terminale, you will never forget that is the final portion of the spinal cord, okay? And similar to spinal curvatures, the spinal nerves are divided into your cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral and coccygeal groups. We don't really talk about the coccygeal plexus for the spinal nerves. We usually just mention the first four, which is cervical. Actually, if anything, we call it brachial here, and lumbar, and then sacral. But we do call this the thoracic spinal curve in this area, spinal nerve in that area. But we'll get to the different plexes that they will branch out into to innervate tissues of your body. Okay. So that's why, you will see spinal nerves here. That's why we kind of name them here. You see the spinal nerves as C1 or T10 spinal nerve to know from which area of the vertebral column is the spinal nerve coming out of. And of course, there are also individual names for these nerves as well. But thankfully, we are only narrowing down to just a few spinal nerve names that you have to know in each area of the body. But there is specific name for every one of these spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord. And for those of you looking into medical school, be ready for the real anatomy course when they require for you to know every single little bone's name, blood vessel's name, and nerve's name in the body. And instead of animals, you might even have to identify these on a human cadaver, which is a lot more complex. So enjoy anatomy while it is simple in college here, okay? All right, so now on to looking at smaller structures within the spinal cord, looking at it as a transverse section or transverse plane. Every spinal segment of the spinal cord is associated with what we call a spinal ganglia. And ganglion, here you see it's spelling ganglion. Ganglion just means it's singular. Ganglia is for plural, okay? But we briefly mentioned this word when we were talking about satellite cells. If you go back to chapter 12, when we were talking about neuroglia in the peripheral nervous system, we said that these satellite cells are residing within ganglia, which are where the cell bodies of the peripheral nervous system nerves are living in. So within the spinal ganglion here, it contains cell bodies of the sensory neurons relaying the information towards the spinal cord, okay? And remember that sensory neuron in the peripheral nervous system are usually unipolar neuron. So their cell body, for example, so let me erase that. And then I'll draw a neuron in there. So if there's a cell body coming off of there, okay, remember unipolar neurons looks like this with two axons splitting, and then you have dendrites and axon terminal on either side. So that's the cell body within the spinal ganglion. And then you have an axon going this way for receiving information from the sensory receptors in your peripheral parts of your body, maybe your skin receptor, those tactile receptors, Meissner's corpuscle, Pacinian's corpuscle we talked about in the integumentary system, for example. Then they will send those via these axon, and then you have another axon going the other way for relaying those information back toward the central nervous system, specifically your spinal cord here in this case. So that's why is those unipolar neurons that are mostly making up your peripheral nervous system. And that's why you have an expanded region here that's called the ganglion, because cell bodies are larger than the diameter of an axon. So that's why you need that expanded region for the cell body to fit into those areas. And sometimes there may be even satellite cells around it that regulate those interstitial fluid around the neuron. Okay, so that's why you have those expanded region. Okay, so the posterior or dorsal, now remember we can use these anatomical direction terms interchangeably for humans when we talked about this all the way back from chapter 1. For humans, anterior is the same as ventral, posterior is the same as dorsal. So that's why you will see that sometimes somewhere is referring things to dorsal root, somewhere is referring to as posterior root. Regardless, posterior or dorsal, it means the same thing. It's not referring to two different roots on the spinal cord. It is the same thing because direction-wise, they mean the same thing. So for the rest of this lecture and on this diagram here, you see that they use posterior. So I will keep saying posterior for referring to the back of the body, towards the back of the body. Okay, so I won't have to say posterior or dorsal every single time I'm talking about a posterior root or posterior horn. Okay, so make sure you remember that though in your mind in case you see dorsal root somewhere, which isn't the case for lab. They refer to dorsal root and ventral root versus dorsal horn and ventral horn. Okay. All right. So the posterior root here, this is referred to as the posterior root. Okay, let me erase the neuron. Okay, I will have to do a lot of drawings in this particular chapter because things gets a little bit confusing with the way things are aligned or the way they are organized within the spinal cord here. So this section is called the posterior root or the dorsal root because it's in the back. So this part is the posterior of the spinal cord. This is the anterior part of the spinal cord. So posterior root is for axon of sensory neuron or sensory information that is coming into the spinal cord. Okay, so remember that. Don't forget, this is something you have to, that's what I mean by you have to know what structure goes in what direction, carrying what type of information. There's sensory information versus motor information, and they can be carrying sensory motor information from different parts of the body, and they're separated that way on these spinal cord and spinal nerves. Okay, so posterior root is for axon that brings in sensory information coming from your body. Okay, and of course goes into what we'll later call it the posterior horn of the gray matter. We'll get to that in a bit. And then the anterior or ventral root here, okay, this portion is the ventral root, is what carries the axon of motor neurons that extends into the peripheral nervous system to give commands to effector tissue. So I'm going to make an arrow here going this way so you know it's sensory information coming in from the periphery into the spinal cord. Here I'm going to draw an arrow going this way so you remember that is information coming from the spinal cord in form of a command towards the peripheral effector tissue. And they always travel via your anterior root. So this is for motor command. And in class setting, I always draw this whole big drawing of the spinal cord on the board, and I kind of add things to it as I'm talking throughout the entire lecture, because it's really talking about the little parts of each of the spinal cord, and we have to break it down this way because it gets confusing. So maybe you can start a little drawing of your own where you draw the spinal cord just like this, really, really big, and then starts adding stuff to it as I'm talking about it, so you can have one diagram that summarizes the entire process that occurs within the spinal cord and what goes where, what are this, what are that, okay? So again, this is talking about motor commands going through the anterior root as motor command from the spinal cord to the periphery. And here I'm talking about sensory information. Let me erase that. Unipolar neuron. Okay, so this is sensory information, okay, coming in from the periphery towards the central nervous system or the spinal cord via your posterior root. Okay, so make sure we remember which root goes with what and what information they carry and in what direction. Okay. So for adults, those posterior and anterior roots will bend and descend inferiorly past the tip of that conus medullaris of the spinal cord we talked about, and it becomes a region called cauda equina. Okay, cauda equina looks like, it kind of has a resemblance structurally like a horse tail. So if you look up cauda equina, you'll see a lot of times the textbook or the words will always describe it as looking like a horse tail. So if we go back to that previous picture here, so the cauda equina is this region right here. Okay, so it kind of looks like that horse tail that kind of start to taper down into your filum terminale of the spinal cord. Okay, all right, so that's the cauda equina. And distal to each spinal ganglion, moving outwards laterally, there are sensory and motor roots that are bound together to form a single spinal nerve. Okay, so we were talking about this here. Okay, now the book kind of switches on you. What I want you to note here is that these two diagrams here, this diagram and this diagram here, are not in the same orientation. So please don't let it confuse you, because at first I was confused when I first looked at this a long time ago. So I don't know why the textbook did this and not keep it all in the same orientation. But because these are figures from your textbook, I can't rotate it upside down because the words would be upside down. But if that's why I said I usually end up drawing a huge spinal cord on the board so I can add to it in one image, one diagram. Okay, so this diagram here is showing the anterior part of the spinal cord there and posterior of the spinal cord here. And hence this here is the anterior root. This here is the posterior root. Anterior root, posterior root, okay? And they kind of merge, okay, to form that one single spinal nerve that I was talking about earlier, okay? They form that one, and then the funny thing is they will split again, okay? So they merge and then they split again, and we call it something else. We have what's called the anterior ramus, and the posterior ramus here. So same thing, anterior ramus, posterior ramus here, okay? So what these do, the posterior, or you can call it dorsal ramus, is for innervation of the skin and muscles of your back. Okay, so remember posterior for your back. Okay, so that's why you remember if something is coming as a sensory information from your back, it's going towards the posterior ramus, okay, and then it goes into the spinal cord, okay, through the posterior root, okay. Now, the anterior or ventral ramus is for innervation of the ventrolateral body surfaces, including those structures of your body walls and limbs. So anterior or ventral for ventrolateral body surfaces. Think about your tummy, your abdominal chest area, okay? Abdominal area, and those including your body wall and also your upper limbs and lower limbs is, for example, if you are touching something with your fingers, for example, those sensory information is going to travel via your anterior ramus. So information is going to come through here, anterior ramus, and then it's going to travel towards your posterior roots, because it's a sensory information, into your posterior horn, and then come right back out if it's coming right from the spinal cord this way in form of a motor command. If it's pain coming in, then you're going to jerk your hand away. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this whole route that the sensory information, spinal cord, and then the motor command goes when we get to that area. Okay, so remember that this is the anterior ramus, this is the posterior ramus, and it splits from the single area, okay, and then it goes into the spinal cord either as posterior root, through the posterior roots, okay, for sensory information, or motor information coming out in the anterior root of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the only more confusing or tough part of this chapter, is being very clear of which direction things are traveling into, with anterior, posterior, ramus, root, horn, and then we're going to get to nuclei in a bit, somatic versus visceral, sensory versus nuclei versus motor. It's going to get very, very confusing very quickly. So make sure you start drawing these while I'm talking through it, because I can't draw it with you on the board as I will in class. So make sure you have some kind of drawing as I'm talking about this, okay? So I would put right here, anterior ramus, I would put body, wall, and limbs, for example, okay? And then the posterior ramus here, I would put back, okay? So which includes skin or muscles, okay? All right. So, make sure you remember what these ramus innervate, because these are the type of questions that can be asked on the exam. Like if someone feels another person is poking their back, okay, for example, in a question, and I will ask, is that sensory information going through the posterior or anterior ramus of your spinal nerves, okay? And that, of course, because it has to do with the back, so it's the posterior ramus of the spinal nerve, okay? So be expecting these type of questions on the exam, okay? All right, so, and just as we had 3 cranial meningeal layers in chapter 14 when we talked about the brain, we also have 3 spinal meninges for this chapter 13 about the spinal cord. And they also serve the very same purpose as those in the brain for that physical stability and also shock absorption. Remember, I talked about this being analogous to seatbelts in a car, okay? And there's still blood vessels that goes through these layers to deliver oxygen and nutrients to these cells, just like your cranial meninges. Okay, so let's start by talking about the most outer layer called the dura mater, just like the brain. Now, what's different in the spinal cord for dura mater is that between the dura mater and the walls of the vertebral foramen of each vertebral bone, so this right here, this white line right here, is the dura mater. This is that back wall of the vertebral foramen, okay, and you see something in between. So that something in between is a space called epidural space, and can you easily remember where that is? Epi for top of, so it is a space on top of the dura mater. That's why it's called epidural space. And this space here is not for cerebrospinal fluid to travel, so don't confuse this with the subarachnoid space. The space here is packed with areolar tissue, blood vessels, and mostly adipose tissue as well. That's why you see all these fat cells here. because it's mostly made up of that for insulation and protection of the spinal cord as extra layers. Because at least the skull we don't have holes in the skull, large gaps in the skull where our brain can be damaged. But for the spinal cord, there are gaps between those vertebral bones. They are not entirely enclosing around the spinal cord, and hence that's why there's these extra layers to make sure we're protecting the spinal cord from injury. Okay, and this is also why we can inject, for example, pain medication here in this epidural space. And, due to there are lots of blood vessels here in this area. And that's why when women go for C-section or want pain medication while they go through labor and delivery, they call it the epidural. It's because that's where that needle is going into, the epidural space, to continuously deliver that drug or pain medication within that area of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, this dura mater layer of the spinal cord will taper over the posterior surface of the sacrum into a dense cord of collagen fibers called the coccygeal ligament. So that's why if we go back to that slide here, you see coccygeal ligament. Okay, so that's where the end or filum terminale is finishing up at. And that coccygeal ligament is what will blend and attach to the coccyx. So the dura mater becomes that coccygeal ligament and attach it to the coccyx. And this will be what hold and anchor down the spinal meninges, which allows it to act like a seat belt for the spinal cord. Make sure it doesn't swerve off to the side or anything like that within the vertebral column, within the vertebral foramen of the vertebral bones. Now, meningitis is then the inflammation of meningeal membranes due to either bacterial or viral infection, and sometimes that can disrupt normal circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. And technically, if it doesn't recover on its own, it can damage neurons and neuroglia because, if there's inflammation of these membranes, those things can travel through the cerebrospinal fluid and get to other neural tissues, including those in your brain. So that's why meningitis can become a serious matter if, especially, it doesn't recover on its own. Now, due to the presence of the blood-brain barrier we talked about between the central nervous system and the rest of your cardiovascular system, the type of medications that can be used to treat meningitis, if it is necessary. Not all meningitis will require medications. A lot of times it may have the capability to recover on its own, let your immune system do its job. But sometimes you will need intervention and you might need to administer medication. So those medication will need to be able to pass through that blood-brain barrier. So that really narrows down the variety of antibiotics that can be used if it was a bacterial infection that caused the meningitis. Okay. All right. So the second layer into this spinal meninge is the arachnoid mater, just like your cranial meninge. So, but contrary to that spider web-like structure of the arachnoid mater in the brain, this layer in the spinal cord is just made up of simple squamous epithelia that goes all the way down to the filum terminale. And again, there is that same subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the most inner layer called the pia mater that we'll talk about next very soon for the cerebrospinal fluid to circulate through. So cerebrospinal fluid circulate through subarachnoid space, not epidural space. And hence a lumbar puncture, or also called the spinal tap, is a procedure that a needle will be inserted into this subarachnoid space there, okay? And usually they go for the region inferior to the lumbar vertebrae, and they will withdraw a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid for any diagnostic testing such as meningitis, okay, because then they will be able to detect traces of virus or bacteria within the cerebrospinal fluid if there was meningitis or infection occurring within the nervous system. So it's a different area that you're going into when you're talking about epidural versus lumbar puncture or spinal tap. Don't confuse the two. And then the most inner layer that surrounds the spinal cord is that is directly attached to the spinal cord is the pia mater. And just like pia mater of the brain, there's also blood vessels that run along the surface of this particular layer in the spinal cord. Now, this picture here is of an actual spinal cord on a cadaver, for example, and it shows the anterior view of it with those 3 spinal meninges kind of peeled away one by one. I kind of like this picture because you can really see how here this layer they say is dura mater reflected, so they kind of cut down the middle and then peel that layer away, and then they cut down the next layer and peel the next layer away, which is arachnoid mater, and they say it's reflected, which is right here. They peel that layer away here, and then they left that last layer, which is the pia mater, on partially attached to the spinal cord. So you can really see those 3 layers of dura mater, arachnoid mater, and then pia mater. And then you have the surface of the spinal cord, and you can see a lot of white stuff. Okay, and we'll talk about what those white matter is when we get to that part. Okay, in a bit. And here's that blood vessel right here that goes up, okay? And that's residing within the pia mater that I was talking about. And here are those anterior and posterior roots that we were talking about coming out of the spinal cord. So it's not just drawing, but they kind of look like exactly what those cartoon image of the spinal cord looks like, okay? So anterior root and then the posterior root. All right, so the gray matter of the spinal cord forms this butterfly-shaped region right here in the center, where we view the spinal cord in its, when we view the spinal cord in its transverse plane. If we go to cut that transversely, as in, a transverse cut through the spinal cord, that's what we will see. And again, it's gray because this particular area of the spinal cord is dominated by cell bodies of neurons or unmyelinated axons and neuroglia cells as well. And just like there is an anterior and posterior root for the spinal cord, there's anterior and posterior horns of the gray matter, as I've mentioned earlier. So there's also a lateral horn here, but you don't have to know that for lab practical or the exam. What I'm concerned with is as long as you know at least the anterior horn and the posterior horn, then that's good enough. And you may see it in lab as dorsal horn versus ventral horn. Now they come together toward the center, these 2 areas of gray matter, which makes them, I would call it the 2 parts of the butterfly wing. They kind of merge and come towards the center in this region here called the gray commissure. Okay, so this region right here, this gray matter and all that surround the central canal of the spinal cord is known as the gray commissure. This is where axons can actually cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other side. Sometimes that happens. It doesn't always have to go straight up and down, but you can actually go through across to the other side. And for example, what's coming from the left side of the body can be then coming through to the right side of the upper body, okay, upper part of the central nervous system. So sometimes that can happen, okay? And we'll learn that this traveling of axons from one side of the body to the other is called decussation. I'll talk about that when we get to chapter 15 and 16. So, and remember that you have that central canal here, okay, within for cerebrospinal fluid to go through, okay. Another thing you have to identify in lab was anterior median fissure, which is this gap right here you're seeing. And the gap is larger anteriorly when compared to the posterior. So that's why they call it a sulcus versus a fissure. Same thing with what I talked about in lab review about lateral sulcus versus transverse fissure or longitudinal fissure. Fissure goes deeper into the tissue, whereas sulcus is not as deep and usually not as obvious, okay? So that's how on histology of the spinal cord or models of the spinal cord, how can you tell which is the anterior side, which is the posterior side? It's by looking for this gap right here in the anterior portion, or you can look for the connection or smaller wing of the butterfly shape here. And usually if it's a posterior root and horn, they're closer to attachment than right here. I don't know, I've seen that in histology slides a lot of times where the posterior horn is a lot closer to the posterior root when comparing the anterior horn's distance from the anterior root. So there's usually a bigger gap here compared to back here. That's another way you can tell whether I'm pointing to a posterior versus anterior portion of the spinal cord. Okay? All right, and within these gray matter horns, here are more parts that you have to know. There are specific areas called nuclei, just like the brain. You have the sensory nuclei, which is this region right here, sensory nuclei. And then you have the, sensory nuclei again is for relaying sensory information from the peripheral receptor toward the central nervous system, such as the spinal cord. And then you have motor nuclei, which is this right here, this region right here in the front. Okay, and we'll talk about the division of visceral versus somatic in a bit, but the motor nuclei is for issuing motor commands from the central nervous system toward peripheral effector tissues. Okay. So the white matter of the spinal cord is called the white columns, and they're divided into 3 regions. Very easy. Posterior white column if it's in the back, lateral white column if it's to the side, or anterior white column if it's in the front. Okay, so it's pretty easy to remember. And then we already know that white matter is made up of myelinated axons. So bundles of these axons that are of the same diameter, amount of myelination, and hence propagation speed, because we talked about how myelin has to do with how fast that impulse is coming through when we talked about this in chapter 12. So all of those neurons that have the same diameter, myelination, all that stuff will be unified together in what we call tracts. Okay, so all the axons within a tract will relay the same type of information in the same direction. Now, if you think of tracks like elevators, it's really kind of like that, okay? Different tracks represent different elevators that carry passengers to different levels in the building. So you may have those that, really tall skyscrapers in other states or countries where they have connecting elevators in the same building. So some elevators will go from level 1 through 20, for example, and then you have to switch and hop over to another elevator to go from level 21 to 40. We have a lot of these in Hong Kong, actually, which is where I was born in. But these tracks kind of reminds me of that. So there are short tracks versus long tracks that go between different parts of the spinal cord. So short tracks are those that carry sensory or motor information between different segments of the spinal cord that are closer together. That's why they call it short tracks. While long tracks are like these accelerated elevators that will carry information from the spinal cord all the way up to the big boss, which is our brain. Okay, so you have short tracks versus long tracks. And that's all, you have to distinguish for white columns in the sense of white matter within the spinal cord. And of course, just like elevators that goes up and down, there are tracks that go upwards or downwards for information going up or information coming down. So the tracks that are going upwards are called ascending tracks. And since they're going upwards, usually they're carrying sensory information toward the brain. Okay, so sensory information toward the brain if it's ascending tracks, such as the red here that you're seeing in this particular diagram. And then those that go downwards, information that goes downwards, are utilizing descending tracts, which since they're going downwards, we're usually carrying motor commands from the brain to the spinal cord and then towards your peripheral nervous system to whatever motor movement the brain is commanding certain part of your body is supposed to do. Okay, so green here is representing those descending tracts going downwards for motor commands. All right. Now we talked about how every segment of the spinal cord is connected to a pair of spinal nerves, and these spinal nerves are organized actually in a similar fashion to skeletal muscle fibers. So here it goes, talking about organization again. You have an outermost layer called the epineurium that contains your bundles of axons called fascicles. So this layer right here is the most outer layer of a spinal nerve called the epineurium, and within there you have multiple of these circles which represent one fascicle of neurons, and each fascicle is surrounded by another layer called perineurium. Okay, so this right here is the perineurium. Okay, so epineurium for the entire spinal nerve, perineurium for surrounding the fascicle, and then you have endoneurium, which is wrapped around one neuron. Okay, so if you pull out one of these, this is, for example, a motor neuron or something. Okay, and it's surrounded by a layer of endoneurium. Okay, so one fascicle is usually made up of multiple neurons, just like how one fascicle of the muscle fiber is made up of the muscle is made up of multiple muscle fibers. Here, one fascicle is made up of multiple neurons. And remember the epi, peri, and endo, and you should be fine. You're just now replacing them instead of mycelium. Now you're calling them neurium for neurons. And in terms of blood supply to spinal nerve, there are arteries and veins that will penetrate into the epineurium, branch within the perineurium, and then you have capillaries that leave the perineurium and branch into the endoneurium that will supply axons and Schwann cells of your neurons and fibroblasts of your connective tissues with oxygen, nutrients, etc., or carrying away waste materials like carbon dioxide and other stuff. Okay, all right. Now, this figure here may look very familiar, from what we saw in the integumentary system for tension lines. But remember, these are not the same thing. It looks similar, but these are not tension lines. This diagram showing here is what we have these areas. You see this area here, for example, or the green area here. Those represent what we call dermatome. Dermatome are a specific bilateral region of skin surface monitored by a single pair of spinal nerves. So here's T1, and here's the dermatome of that area that particular spinal nerve serves, okay? And then you have T7 here, which serves this area or this area of the back, or, this is the anterior part of the body, this on this side, this is the posterior part of the body on this side, okay? So each pair of spinal nerve will, sort of innervate a particular region of your body skin surface, and we refer that to as dermatome. Now, and hence, this is why when a specific pair of spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord is damaged or compressed, for example, what we talked about in a herniated disc or something, remember we mentioned that from our bone chapter about herniated disc and what they are, it can compress on a specific spinal nerve. Now, that will produce a corresponding loss of sensation within the dermatome that specific pair of spinal nerves serves. So this is known as the peripheral neuropathies. Peripheral meaning peripheral parts of your body, neuropathies meaning you don't feel anything. And this can actually be loss of both sensations and motor function in that region, okay? Just depending where it is compressed or damaged. Remember, you have that merged area of the spinal cord that can be for sensory or motor, okay, coming in. So when we feel numbness in certain areas of the body, we may be able to trace it back to the particular spinal nerve via these dermatome location, though we must emphasize that it is not exactly precise, but it at least may provide some clues as to the underlying reason for your sudden numbness in certain part of your body, or at least a possible diagnosis of a symptom, and whether we can rule it out or not will then follow. Your doctor will follow up with you. All right. So now that we have talked about the different parts of the spinal cord pretty clearly, and we know what are the ramus, what are the spinal nerve, what are the horn and roots. Now we can follow the peripheral distribution of spinal nerves, how does sensory information arrive at the spinal cord, or how does motor information goes outwards from the spinal cord, and what route do they take when they're coming from or going towards different parts of the body. So we'll start here with the sensory information first, arriving from peripheral tissue and delivering that information toward the spinal cord. Okay. Now we talked about the spinal nerve can be split into posterior or anterior rami. So here's that posterior rami, and here is that anterior rami. Posterior rami is for carrying information from the skin and skeletal muscles of the back. Remember, posterior for your back. And then anterior rami is for carrying information from the ventrolateral body surfaces and structures within the body wall and limbs. Okay. And remember, anterior for your limbs and front side of the body. Okay, so now the posterior anterior rami will then send sensory information toward the spinal ganglion here. So they're coming in this way, coming in this way, and then they will come together within the spinal ganglion here, where you see the cell body of the unipolar neuron, of the sensory neuron coming through. Then they will relay that information towards the posterior roots of the spinal cord. Okay, and then from there, they will then move on to the posterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, which is then subdivided into either your somatic sensory nuclei or visceral sensory nuclei. Okay, so let me go through that one more time. So sensory information coming from skin or skeletal muscles of your back will travel through the posterior rami into the spinal ganglion, into the posterior root, through the posterior horn of the gray matter into either somatic or visceral sensory nuclei, depending what it is coming from. Okay, and then you have, or if you have sensory information coming from your front part of your body or their limbs, then it will travel through anterior rami into the spinal ganglion towards a posterior root, posterior horn, and then into either somatic sensory nuclei or the visceral sensory nuclei. So the somatic sensory nuclei will carry information from skin and skeletal muscles. Remember what I talked about, the word somatic means usually directs to. So in this case, usually most of the time when you hear the word somatic, it mostly means skeletal muscle, but here it also includes the skin as well. So somatic for skin and skeletal muscle information. Okay. Now, visceral sensory nuclei will carry information coming from your internal organs, glands, and blood vessels as well. Remember what I talked about visceral, okay? The word visceral stands for internal organs, and here it includes glands and blood vessels as well. Now, I won't ask about the rami communicantes that you're seeing here, but there doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I won't ask for that on the exam because I feel like we have already enough of stuff going on through the spinal cord here. So we won't talk about the rami communicantes, but they do collect sensory information from your visceral organs as well. And that's why you see this purple sensory neuron coming through a different route into the spinal ganglion, into the particularly visceral sensory nuclei. But you still have sensory information coming from your somatic part of the body through your anterior rami or posterior rami as well, depending whether we're talking about information coming from interoceptors versus exteroceptors. We'll talk about these when we get to chapter 15 and chapter 16's lecture. Okay, so there are exteroceptors and internal receptor. Exteroreceptor goes toward the somatic sensory nuclei because those have to do with skin and skeletal muscles of the body. Interoceptors usually have to do with those organs and glands, so it goes into that visceral sensory nuclei. Okay, so there's a couple things here, divisions here. Remember your posterior rami and anterior rami, spinal ganglion, posterior root, posterior horn, which is further divided into somatic sensory nuclei versus visceral sensory nuclei. This whole region here is called the sensory nuclei. All right. Okay, so now for delivery of motor commands, it then goes in the opposite direction. Information will originate from the motor nuclei of the spinal cord, which remember is this portion, the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And these are just typical organization of the spinal nerves within the thoracic and superior lumbar segments. And that's what I mean by this parentheses here. They're just typical organization within those segments. Other segments of the spinal cord may be slightly different in organization, but we just need to know the general one. Okay, so motor commands will start from the visceral or somatic motor nuclei, depending whether the motor commands is for internal organs or skin and skeletal muscles. So this is the visceral motor nuclei, which if it's a command for internal organs, that's where the motor command will be originating from. If it's coming from the somatic motor nuclei, a command coming from there, then this is a motor command that will be going towards your skin or skeletal muscles, okay? And then those commands will travel from, you see how there's these cell bodies here, via axon, okay? So that's why we talked about how most of your central nervous system is multipolar neuron. So that's that multipolar neuron within the spinal cord coming out, okay? So then it will travel via your ventral root or anterior root of the spinal cord, then splits into either your posterior ramus and or your anterior ramus. So posterior ramus right here, anterior ramus right there. Okay. It all, which way it splits that command information, whether it splits to posterior or anterior rami, then it depends whether it is a motor command for skin muscles of the back or for your ventrolateral body surfaces, body wall, and limbs. So that's why you have the skin muscles of the back for posterior ramus or body wall, ventrolateral body surface, and limbs for your anterior ramus. Okay, so from visceral or somatic motor nuclei of the gray horn, anterior gray horn, it goes into ventral root, and then your dorsal or anterior and posterior and anterior rami. Okay. All right, so it's about an hour, so I will stop here as part 1 of chapter 13. It's a relatively straightforward and short chapter, so in part 2, I don't think it will take another hour. So I'll see you in part 2 of the video.